Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. The 2024 UK general election result may never have really been in doubt, but beneath the surface there is a lot happening in the country that dared not speak its name in the election campaign. England, with gains for Greens, returned MPs for reform, Galloway gone, but Gaza's plight being central to some independents, not least a certain Jeremy Corbyn defeating Labour candidates in surprising places. The Westminster results tell us an interesting story of a changing nation. Meanwhile, with the many ministers in the new UK government essentially becoming English ministers, what does this government's mandate mean for policy east of the border? What do the new Metro Mayor results tell us about England's ongoing quasi-federalisation? And what are the public attitudes driving this? To discuss this, we're joined by John Denham, Professorial Fellow on English Identity and Politics at Southampton University, and Director of the English Labour Network, as well as being a former minister in the last Labour government. Hello, John.
Hello, good to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Before we dive into the detail of the UK election in England, could you tell us a little bit about how you reflect on the top-line results of the last few weeks, and what was your response as a former English Labour MP?
Well, the headline obviously is, very big gains for Labour. They gained 168 seats compared with 2019. Big losses for the Tories, who lost 215. Big gains for the Liberal Democrats, gained 58 seats. And then smaller breakthroughs, but Reform got 5 seats, and the Greens went from 1 to 4. And of course, as you mentioned, there were independents. So it's a big change in the political landscape. That's the most obvious thing. And changes will follow for the governance of England and from the UK as a result. I think the thing that has to be said in any looking at this election is that underneath that is quite curious. The two parties that gained most, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, did so with more or less identical shares of the vote as they had in 2019. Widely seen as a catastrophic election for the Labour Party, but also for the Liberal Democrats, who only won 7. So it was an election result produced by parties having the voters they needed in the places that mattered in order to deliver the results. But on the other end of the spectrum, you also saw the most spectacular collapse in the coalition that the Conservatives had assembled in 2019. I'm sure we'll come back to identity and politics, but they got nearly 7 out of 10 of the people who identified as more English than British in that Get Brexit Done election. That's shattered all over the place. They lost votes to the Liberal Democrats. They lost votes to Reform. So a remarkable electoral coalition of 5 years ago has fallen apart. So those are the big picture things. And then I'm sure we can come back in more detail to look at Reform, the independents and so on. But that would be the broad message. Huge political change. Not so much because of overwhelming popularity of Labour and the Liberal Democrats, collapse and splintering of the Conservative electoral coalition.
Labour's results in England and Scotland this time round mean that it does now have a credible mandate from all the British nations. And I've also noticed the SDLP sitting on the Labour benches, which I think goes some way to explaining Keir Starmer's statement that they have a mandate from all 4 of the UK's nations. Now, this hasn't happened in 20 years. What does that mean for the party and how that will change its approach?
It's not quite clear to me. I think it's going to be one of the most interesting questions the next few years. You're absolutely right. This is the first election since 2005 in which a government of the UK has had a majority in all of the British nations. And you can argue about Northern Ireland, but certainly in Wales, Scotland and England, that majority hasn't been there. Conservative rule, the coalition depended entirely really particularly under Boris Johnson, but before that, on England having enough Conservative MPs to impose that on an SNP-led Scotland or a Labour-led Wales. What does it mean, though, in terms of the mandate for the United Kingdom? I think that's not entirely clear. I mean, one way of looking at it is you could say, underneath the headline results, many of the tensions are there that have been there before. So the SNP is in real difficulty, but support for independence in Scotland hasn't significantly diminished. Labour in Wales, new leader, it's not clear whether Labour in Wales is suffering sort of terminal problems from being in power for so long or whether it can recover. But you could see potential resurgence of independence in Scotland. You could see possibly a reform challenge to Labour in Wales. You've also got issues in England we'll come back to about what might happen in future mayoral elections. So part of you might say this is the ideal moment for a majority government to actually come up with a constitutional settlement that takes things further forward and perhaps involves changing the voting system. The problem is, of course, that in real politics, this is the worst possible government to ask to make any fundamental changes because they've only just got elected on the basis of the current electoral system and the current arrangements. But what I think that means is tensions will emerge within the government of the Union between the aspirations of the nations, the aspirations of England, and whether you can form a compelling news story of what the Union should look like in the future. I mean, last point, you'll know that I'm one of many people that gave evidence to the Welsh Government's Commission on the Future of the Union. And I personally, I'm in that position that wants the Union to survive, but think it needs a new and compelling story if it's going to do so. Historically, this is a moment where that could be grasped. Whether it will be, we'll have to see.
So you've talked then about England, Labour's approach to Englishness. You run the English Labour Network. Can you tell us a little bit about the network, what it is and its purpose?
Well, yes, it's a very small group of people, sort of ginger group within the Labour Party. Usually describes itself as for Labour in England and for England in Labour. So in other words, wanting to see Labour's cause advanced in every part of England. And from that point of view, Labour's successes from Cornwall to Cumbria are very much in line with what we wanted. But we've also wanted to argue the England case within England. And we have felt that, in a sense, the Anglo-centric English view of the world, which is actually the traditional view of the Labour Party in England, that tends to conflate England and Britain, England and the Union, has worked against Labour's long-term interests. It's meant that there hasn't been a sufficient focus on how England is governed. There hasn't been for sufficient engagement of ideas of English identity. And in some ways, because that projection of England as Britain really does annoy people in Wales and Scotland. You don't have to be a nationalist in Wales or Scotland to be annoyed by the English going around talking about England and Britain as the same place. We think it's been damaging to the Union. So basically, we try and find ways of taking those arguments forward. And so we were, in a gentle way, we noticed, even when the new government was formed, the first day, the flags in Downing Street were of Scotland, Wales and Britain. And there were no English flags there. And it did change that evening because England were in the Euros, but it was a stark presentation of, I think, the difficulty that the Labour Party often has in talking about England as England, even when it is. So most of the manifesto policies that the UK Labour published were for England only, because huge areas of them are completely devolved. Very little was done during the election campaign to say to English voters, this is a complex situation. The NHS in Scotland or in Wales is not run by the same people as it will be in England.
So I'm going to ask politicians and former politicians' least favourite type of question, which is a hypothetical question. Obviously, Labour now has a big majority with a number of seats in Scotland, Wales, and of course in England. Do you think that the way that Keir Starmer would have governed for the UK would have been different if he was reliant solely on Welsh and Scottish MPs for his majority?
That's interesting because what it's harder for me to know, speaking as I do from England and doing my political practice here, is the sort of pressures that he might have been under those circumstances, or in fact might still be under, because you can have a big majority. You can't go around ignoring everybody. And it's not yet clear to me, it might be clearer to you, at least in Wales, the extent to which Welsh Labour MPs will articulate a clear Welsh set of Labour interests that aligns with the Welsh Labour Party in Wales. I think it's been well recognised over the last 20 years or so that Welsh Labour, probably uniquely of the nations, managed to tell a story that was both Welsh and Labour in a distinctive way, much more successfully than the Labour Party told a story about Scotland and Labour. It's not yet clear whether Scottish Labour has that distinctly Scottish Labour message that it needs to evolve. Now, my guess is that the politics of both those nations will require the Labour Party in both of those nations to have a distinctive national story as well as a UK story. So, although the majority of MPs elected from both nations will undoubtedly be unionists and that they are in favour of continuation of the union, the political imperatives will be to tell strong Welsh and Scottish stories. So I suspect that even though Keir Starmer could, in theory, ignore what they're saying, he won't be able to do that in practice if it's coming through the leaders of the Welsh and Scottish Labour parties and through their MPs in Scotland and as for their parliamentarians in Scotland and Wales. So you might say it makes a difference to the mathematical calculation. I don't think it makes a difference to the political calculation, because the imperative will be for Labour to fight the next set of national elections with a strongly unified voice in Wales and in Scotland. But that will mean that Keir Starmer will have to go some way to reflect what Scottish and Welsh Labour MPs are telling him about their national priorities.
I mean, one of the things that comes up a lot in the discourse in Wales relating to the different policy positions of Welsh Labour members of the Senedd and Welsh Labour members of Parliament is that often Welsh Labour MPs are not always so keen to see additional devolution. So do you think that narrative may play into it at all? That if, for example, the main voice Keir Starmer is hearing on potentially the devolution of additional powers is from his MPs and not his MSs or MSPs?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one that I'm not very well placed to comment on, because I don't know those MPs these days. But I can tell you that in England, there will be MPs who will be very reluctant to see the devolution of powers, further powers to mayors and combined authorities, because they will have spent 14 years getting to Westminster, and then they find that their government is empowering Andy Burnham or Richard Parker or whatever, and that these locally devolved people are taking decisions that, in a sense, they as MPs have to fall in behind. The real challenge here, I mean, and we'll have to see what happens, the political, rhetorical, policy commitment to devolution is very, very strong. So I think if Keir Starmer's prepared to override the hesitations of some of his English MPs, then I suspect he will give due weight to what's coming from the Senedd and the Scottish Parliament. The caveat, I would say, as a former politician, is that Labour needs to get its act together in Cardiff. I mean, it hasn't come across to the English observer as a compelling political force for the last few months. And I honestly don't know if this is because people have made mistakes or it's been misfortune or whatever, but clearly it hasn't had the coherence and the unity that you need. I think if there's a powerful message coming from Labour in Cardiff, then actually Keir will respond to that.
So you're talking about devolution. Obviously, one of the major differences between England and Wales and Scotland is England is undergoing this internal devolution process. You've got your metro mayors, etc. And pretty much all of them were again re-elected this year, and all but one of them were Labour. What kind of impact do you think that the role of metro mayors has had on the politics of England?
I mean, at the moment, its major impact, if we are truly honest, is that individual mayors, some of them, have emerged as powerful advocates for their city regions. At the moment, the actual devolution of powers and resources is incredibly limited. If you say the challenge is to transform the nature of your local economy and the delivery of your local public services. So things have got to go an awful lot further, an awful lot more quickly, if the major city regions, as well as those places that don't have devolution deals, are to make a real difference. And it's worth remembering that most devolution in deals in England are nothing like Andy Burnham has in Greater Manchester or Andy Street has. Most of them are pitifully small in terms of resources. But ultimately, I think the argument that's been won, at least theoretically, is that you cannot rebalance the UK or the English economy with the sort of centralisation we have in Whitehall at the moment. So I think the process will continue, but there will be a lot of sheet anchors in Whitehall and in the Treasury who traditionally wanted to hold all the strings, who will try to stop it happening. But I think it's the right direction. One of the big challenges is going to be actually how Labour extends this idea of mission-driven government to take into account the territoriality of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, where many of the powers we're talking about here are actually devolved to those national governments.
So obviously, devolution in Wales and Scotland is often viewed through the prism of, growing national identity. But weirdly, that doesn't seem to correlate with the English experience, and certainly not at a sub-state regional level. But what's your interpretation of the current polling, etc., on English identity and then sub-state regional identity? And is that having any impact on towards of further devolution?
So divide it into three quick things. What is now very clear is that when we measure how English people are, when we say, are you more English than British, more British than English, those types of questions, it's actually often confuses more than anything else. The people who are most strongly English are genuinely also patriotically and strongly British. So they emphasize their English identity, but not in contrast to being British, but as part of their sense of a very English sense of Britishness. Whereas those people who tend to say they're more British than English often are British and English. It's just they're a bit more British than English, and they don't really care about patriotism at all. So I increasingly talk about Englishness with Britishness when we're talking about strong English identity, and Britishness without Englishness when I'm talking about British identity. That's the first point. Having said that, there continues to be an identity bias in how people vote. So back in 2019, of these people who are predominantly English but also strongly British, 70% of them voted for Boris Johnson. Right? He lost amongst the people who were more British than English. Now, in this election, Labour successfully extended its appeal to more of that English and British voting audience. But nonetheless, Reform and the Conservatives together actually took more of the strongly English votes than Labour did. So in other words, and Labour's big strength was amongst the British. So although it didn't have so much impact on the election, mainly because the Conservative Reform vote split, it's still there as a presence in English politics. So it hasn't gone away, but it's not having the very visible impact it was in the first 2 decades of the century. Now, your third question was about sub-regional identity. And again, my view of the evidence is that being English is often very strongly associated with a sense of local identity too. So I would say I'm English, but my Englishness is very strongly in my mind associated with the West Country where I grew up and Southern England where I live now. Likewise, if you are in Yorkshire or if you're in the Northwest area, you may be just as strongly English, but you won't be able to separate that out from your sub-regional identity. So what that means is that mayors and other local leaders can successfully appeal to a sense of that local identity within the national whole. So it's wrong to think of it as one set against the other. It's more about how you communicate the messages. And the same would be true in London, where, which is actually the least English and most British part of England. Sadiq Khan can clearly appeal to a sense of being a Londoner, which embraces a very wide sense of the London sector of the London population.
So one of the really interesting things that came from the King's speech was the English devolution bill. What can we expect from that?
Well, what I think you're going to see there is just to go back for people who are tuning into this, under the Conservative government, particularly under Michael Gove, on the one hand, they developed a number of different layers of devolution deal you could have. But each local authority had to, or combined authority where councils get together, had to negotiate their own separate deal with Whitehall. So everywhere's ended up with something different. There's not obviously any rhyme or reason as to why. It's a very laborious process, and it's happened very, very slowly. So I think the first thing you can see is that framework will firstly become clearer, but secondly, the language being used around ministers, at least if not by them, is devolution by default. So the assumption is that if you want the powers, you can get them, and Whitehall has to give a good reason why not. So that's reversing the logic of where we are at the moment. So I think that that's going to be the most important thing. I think you're then going to see an extension of the powers available. So we already know that bus services, which have been brought back into public, strategic control in Manchester, that power is going to be available in lots of other areas, not necessary areas even that have mayors. And we know that skills are going to be devolved much more than they are at the moment. And we know that there's quite a big case being put that many of the DWP programs that are designed to get back into work, that those should be decentralized because councils know their labour markets much better than civil servants sitting in London. So I think there's a lot. I think a lot is actually going to happen over the next few years. The question is all going to be about the pace of change. How far does it go? And crucially, and this sounds like a really nerdy thing, who's accountable for delivery? At the moment, you can be Andy Burnham, and you've apparently got these powers. At the end of the day, Andy answers to civil servants in Whitehall for the delivery of what he does. And you can say that is not really full devolution. There needs to be a robust system of local accountability for the mayors, not if they've been given the powers, the judgment on whether they use them well should be taken locally.
Thanks, John. Let's talk a little bit about the election campaign. So the view sometimes in Wales is that Labour ran a very British campaign. It was draped in Union Jacks. Obviously, we did see more dry cwchs and more saltires as well, part of that campaign to appeal to both those sort of higher national identifiers in Wales and Scotland. You talked a little bit about how Labour didn't take a majority of strongly English identifying voters, but do you think they have now successfully marked themselves out as the party of progressive British identity that can also take in some of those people with English identity, strong English identities?
We will have to see, because what's remarkable in a sense is that Labour won all these seats without getting more of the votes than they did in 2019. Now, they won more of those seats because by extending their appeal to the more socially conservative, more patriotically English and British section of the electorate, they won votes in places where they needed to win them. But there was a cost to that, and Labour actually lost support amongst those under 40. It lost support amongst younger women. It lost support amongst graduates, and it lost support amongst progressive liberals, all compared with 2019. So I think it's a really interesting challenge now. I mean, what you could say is it's a dilemma. Every time Keir Starmer said this Labour Party has changed, that worked for the people who had been worried about voting Labour. But of course, there's a section of the electorate who, whether or not they like Jeremy Corbyn or not, actually quite like the idea of a radical liberal Labour Party. And so in some sense, every time you said the Labour Party's changed, that was giving a message to those voters, oh, so it's not my party anymore then. And so you did see this set of people drift off, particularly to the Greens and to other places. So there's a real, and I don't know the answer to this, there's a real challenge for the Labour Party as it comes up to the next election. Do you aim to be what is, a more centrist Labour Party with a broader appeal across more different parts of England, or actually is it ultimately important to win back those younger progressive voters that you lost? Because after all, that's probably where most of the members of the Labour Party still come from.
Looking again at one of the real success stories of the night, it's the Lib Dems. The Lib Dems going from, was it 12 seats by the end of the last Parliament, or maybe slightly more, given by-elections. They're fantastic
They
by-elections.
had, yeah, they went from 7 back in 2019. They won some by-elections, but it's 7 5 years ago to 58. They gained another 58. So huge success.
Absolutely, and a lot of those are in the southwest. What
Yeah.
was they called the Blue Wall. There's no real Lib Dem Labour contest left, apart from a few places like Sheffield Hallam.
Yeah.
What does this tell us about the changing nature of English politics?
Well, I think what that showed is the Lib Dems, as much as Labour, concentrated on getting their vote out where it mattered. So their vote share only went up from 12.4% to 13.2%, for which they were rewarded by another 58 seats. So they benefited from a chunk of Tories who wanted to go somewhere else. Some Conservatives went to reform. Lib Dems were never going to get them. But pro-European, broadly more socially liberal, more middle-of-the-road Conservatives were very happy to go for the Lib Dems. So it also showed that despite their long time campaigning for electoral reform, they were able to make first past the post work for them extraordinarily well. But it doesn't show, as with Labour, any greatly increased enthusiasm for Lib Dem policies or politics across England as a whole, just as Labour can't claim there was a huge enthusiasm for Labour across the whole.
What's interesting to me is obviously the last time Labour were in government, the Lib Dems ended up running to Labour's left on a lot of issues. But given their new voter coalition and where a lot of these seats are, do you think they'll be able to satisfactorily run to Labour's left again whilst keeping hold of these shire seats that have usually voted Conservative?
I think it's going to be difficult, and I'm not sure where their instincts will be. I mean, you've got to remember that Ed Davey was a pretty big enthusiast for the austerity programme that the coalition brought in. He was out there justifying it. So I doubt that they will be to the left on most issues, certainly not across the board. There may be some strategic issues where they've prioritised their case. They did that on social care, for example. I would more expect the Liberal Democrats to focus on one or two issues where they feel that they can put Labour under pressure than to be generally in an all-purpose sort of left of Labour position. The second issue, though, that's going to come up, and it's challenging, as it is already for the Greens, is Labour's plans to get growth underway clearly involves some sort of radical reform of the planning system. And we don't know exactly how that's going to be at the moment. But in many of the seats that the Liberal Democrats have won, there will be planning proposals that are locally unpopular. And people who theoretically understand the need for new housing nonetheless will not see the connection between the house on the field next door and a member of their family that can't afford to buy somewhere in London. And I think the Liberal Democrats will, given the nature of their community-based campaigning, will find it enormously difficult not to end up opposing the Labour Party and the Labour government of a whole series of planning issues. We've seen this with the Greens, come up against a power cable to get green energy from the North Sea into the national grid, because that's the sort of constituency they represent. So I think the Lib Dems are more likely to focus on one or two areas where they criticise Labour, unlikely to call for billions of pounds to be spent on the social security system or whatever, but very much taking advantage of opposition to planning reform to oppose Labour in some of those seats and essentially to consolidate their Conservative vote in those areas.
It's really interesting you talk about the Greens, because I was going to come on to that next. The Greens, because they have to represent now sort of very liberal, very metropolitan areas that demand radicalism, such as in Brighton and Bristol, and then they've got two very rural seats where they're going to have to oppose, if they want to get re-elected, very likely going to have to oppose green infrastructure projects. They've almost ended up with a voter coalition that much larger parties have, but they've only got to do it in 4 seats. So how are they going to be able to square that circle?
I don't know. And I think they also have the reality that they have a membership coalition, which is really quite challenging because they have become in some rural areas. I'm not saying that people are not radical, but they have become, if you like, a conservation voice and an effect. Everyone will tell you this, a very effective on the ground campaigning party. But they've also got a whole bunch of people who used to be Corbynite Labour people, or people who are alienated over Gaza, whose history in the Green movement is relatively short. And so I think they've got a real party management job in coming up with a coherent approach to the different electorates they're now trying to face. Now, having said that, the Lib Dems for years managed under Labour, as you said, to be lots of different political parties to different people in different places. So maybe the Greens can do that, but it's quite a challenge.
Whilst we're on the parties of the left, let's deal with those leftish issues. So obviously there was a huge rise in independence, most notably Jeremy Corbyn winning his Islington North seat. What does the election of these individual independents tell us about modern England, especially in those seats that are so motivated by the Israel-Gaza conflict?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I think the Jeremy Corbyn case, I think, is more akin to when Ken Livingstone beat Frank Dobson for the Mayor of London early on at the height of New Labour's popularity. Nonetheless, Labour couldn't win the Mayor of London, an overwhelming Labour city. And I think that is an electoral reaction to what people perceive as an overbearing political party. And I think that, it was the attempts to stop Jeremy Corbyn standing that probably secured him the election, if you see what I mean. In the other cases, the evidence that I find most compelling is that amongst Muslim voters, where there was a disproportionate loss of support for Labour Party, the mobilizing issue was Gaza, Palestine, but it probably spoke to a broader sense amongst some Muslim voters of having been taken for granted by the Labour Party. So just addressing Gaza is probably not going to heal that overnight. And while we're on it, there are some interesting shifts. The most obvious one is the huge consolidation of Hindu voters behind the Conservatives in this election. So there's one group of voters who seem to have swung to the Conservatives. It's amongst Hindu voters, and that's obviously in the smaller number of seats where Hindu votes are particularly high. So one way of looking at this is to say, look, this is a further sense of the fragmentation of the electorate that's been apparent for decades as we're on this long journey from, social class-based parties to a much more diverse electorate. And you could say the independents are a reflection of that, and there are some places where that can win.
Yeah, it certainly felt to me on the night like one of the most volatile elections I've seen in my life. But the big story of the night, obviously beyond the wonderful Labour majority, was the story with Reform UK, and they've won seats for the first time, and they've come second in a number of constituencies across England. What do we know about the people who vote Reform?
What we know about the people who vote Reform is that, broadly speaking, compared with the population as a whole, they are older, whiter, less likely to have been to university. They have socially conservative views on many social issues. They are the most opposed to high levels of immigration. They are particularly concerned about the inability to control the borders, as evidenced by small boats. They were the people who wanted to leave the European Union. Indeed, big chunk of the Leave vote was voting Conservative in 2019. Conservatives seem to have failed on Brexit. They're still in that bloc. So that's who they are. There's a lot of talk at the moment about it being a populist vote, which I think is really unhelpful, because it's how liberals talk about people they don't like. And I think it is much better to say, actually, what Reform offers is a view of the nation, of where its boundaries are, how it should be governed, who should belong to it, in whose interest does it work. And it might be a view of the nation that lots of people with liberal implications don't like very much, but they are fighting around a view of the nation. And I think we can expect them to continue to do that in the future.
Yeah, I think they're going to, we're looking at it from a Welsh angle, John, and everyone is thinking that Reform are going to do incredibly well in the next Senate election with our purely proportional system. But I agree with you on the populist point. I think we've got to get away from that kind of language, because populism in the eyes of many is things they don't like. But what populism actually is basically a fundamental purpose of political parties is trying to be popular and promising things that people want to do, right?
That's right. And I think you're right to say it's going to be a Welsh issue, because you can, I'm not an expert at all, but you can see there was that chunk of Welsh working class vote that voted Leave. You can see there's that chunk of Welsh Conservative vote that has never been that keen on devolution, and is very British in its identity. And you can sort of see how, if there are grievances to exploit, they can be exploited. And I think the difficulty that faces politics in many different places, and certainly in England, is that in an ideal world, you would say, with a new government, you will deliver such tangible change to the NHS or to schools or to the railways or whatever, that these grievances go away. But that's not going to happen on the timescale that we're talking about. So my view is you can only counter populism by dealing with the national question, but by having a more compelling, more exciting, more progressive version of what the nation looks like. You can't deal with it just by saying they're populists and you shouldn't have anything to do with it.
So we've clarified that they're not a populist party of the right, but a lot of people, especially people in Wales, would probably try and categorize them as some form of English or British national party. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I would imagine that's part of where they draw on, because there's always been this, as I read the evidence from Richard Wynne-Jones and others, you've got this sort of, well, in some ways Wales is the most British part of Britain. You've always had a bit of the Welsh vote, which has clung to a sense of British identity, but you've also had a part of the Welsh vote that prioritised in Brexit Britain's exit from the European Union over the Welsh Labour or politics they'd been voting for previously. So I think it would probably be a mistake to characterise it as a purely English thing, so much as a version of the nation that some people who in other ways are culturally and politically quite Welsh buy into when it comes to the idea of the UK as a union state, if you like. So I'd be broadly cautious and slightly worried if I heard people saying, well, we can criticize it for being an English thing. I suspect that might be underestimating its appeal to some people who in other ways would confidently regard themselves as Welsh.
It's very fascinating from an English and Welsh perspective now, is that looking at how poorly Reform did in Scotland. So is there anything, do you think, that sort of explains why they've struggled to break through there? Obviously, again, caveats, neither of us are experts in Scottish politics, but trying to understand why they struggle to break through there in the same kind of way that they do in Scotland and Wales. Is that, do you think, because there's fewer British identifiers left in Scotland?
I think it's that the people who were unionists in Scotland had a different fight to win, and that was to beat the SNP. And so if you're a unionist in Scotland, you were going to be much more preoccupied, if you were at all centre or left, in making sure the Labour Party got elected, and you're probably going to perhaps stick with the Conservatives somewhere else. So I think that it's that's part of it. It's also to some extent true, you can overstate this, that because of depopulation and other things, the immigration politics hasn't played out in quite the same way in Scotland as it has certainly in England, where, for 20 years, there has been much more of an elite consensus about talking about Scotland as a diverse nation with a diverse sense of national identity. But I wouldn't overstate that. I think it's more that if you've got one big fight going on in town, like Labour SNP, you're less likely to drift off into a third party result. But you get to a situation where maybe Labour government doesn't manage to solve everything in 2 weeks, and the SNP still haven't recovered. maybe that changes the environment in Scotland, but that's pure speculation.
Okay, so one more question on reform. What do you think is the fundamental explanation of the rise of reform in England?
I think it is that they have appealed to a group of people with a strong sense of nationhood, with a limited idea of who should belong to it, who are particularly concerned about the effect of immigration, and reform has managed to articulate a message that mobilized those people effectively. So for this group, for most voters, issues like the NHS, cost of living, were higher priorities, whoever you voted for. For this group of voters, they found a group of people who actually prioritize another set of issues. Big debate in England is this the limit? Reform, okay, so Reform got 15%. UKIP got 15% in 2015, people say. Didn't go along and win loads of seats, so is this a ceiling? I would say two things in response to that. Firstly, UKIP did only get 15% in 2015. They didn't win loads of MPs. They still transformed the entire politics of the United Kingdom by winning their campaign for a referendum and then winning the referendum and then effectively bequeathing the Johnson government. If you've got people who can drag 15% of the vote, that can shape your Welsh elections that are coming up. It can shape English mayoral elections. Other parties get drawn to contesting for those votes. So even at 15%, reform can shape the rest of politics. The second thing, and I probably shouldn't be saying this because I don't want them to listen to me, where they've got it wrong is that their voters are left of centre economically, right? So the marriage of the appeal to the nation that reform projects and city spiv boy free marketeering that Nigel Farage and his supporters represent is not very attractive to their voters. They actually want the railways nationalised. Okay, they want public services and they want things done properly by the government in their interest. And the real issue is if they could sort of do what National Rally in France have done, move to a different generation of leaders and ones that are much more economically nationalist, I think their potential is much higher than 15%. But I don't want them to listen to me because I don't want them to go and do it at the moment. So I think Farage represents both their icon and their limit. But we can't assume that the leadership will always be Farage.
Yeah, it's something I've always said, John. It's the thing that really scares me as a Labour supporter is the idea of a economically so left-wing and a socially right-wing party, because it's as much as a lot of liberal Labour voters may not wish to admit it, often it is kind of a lot of where our core vote comes from.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and I think that sooner or later they will come for that. Now, the challenge then for the left, the Labour Party, is to do national and national identity politics better than we do it at the moment, by not being afraid to talk about nation, but talking about it in a broadly progressive and inclusive way. Now, that I would say historically, what has for 20 years been the achievement of Welsh Labour, done it much more successfully than the Labour Party in England or the Labour Party in Scotland. I hope Welsh Labour finds its way back to the sort of politics that Rodri and Carwyn represented so well, but other parts of the nation, of the UK rather, need to learn from that.
So the last party we'll deal with this evening is the Conservatives. What do we know about the state of the Conservative Party after this devastating loss, probably their worst ever general election performance? And why have so many people stepped away from the party that won this commanding majority back in 2019?
Well, we've got an internal issue and an external issue. A significant part of the Conservative Party has persuaded itself that transatlantic politics of Trump plus a dose of reform is where the future of the Conservative Party lies. And other people in the Conservative Party understand that you have to, at the end of the day, they do need to win back their voters, but they want those voters that they've lost to reform, or win back most of them. But actually, they have to win back the much more centrist voters that they've lost in the last election to Labour and the Lib Dems. So one of the reasons the Tories are in such a mess is they have this profound disagreement about what sort of party it is. You not only got the left-right split, you've got this tension between, is the Conservative Party a Conservative Party with all that used to mean in terms of monarchy, marriage, Church of England, all of that stuff, or is it as a radical libertarian party? So ideologically, they're all over the place. The second problem is that they have a membership that is, I mean, all political party memberships by definition are out of step with the rest of the electorate, because joining a political party is a really odd thing to do. But nonetheless, the Conservative Party membership is probably more out of step with the people who might vote Conservative in terms of being very right-wing and Farageist. And so the Tories have got a practical problem in finding a candidate who can take them in a more sensible direction and get elected by the party membership.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I think these splits, these ideological fractures are showing up in their ongoing leadership contest. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, as well as, yes, that issue of the members, isn't it? Really, you're, even if the Conservative MPs could see where they were going wrong and wanting to move more to the centre ground, the likelihood is, as we saw with the battle between Truss and Sunak, they'll still probably pick the most quote unquote right wing of the candidates, right?
Yeah, and then you get into the situation like Tom Tugendhat, who I don't know, but classically would have been the middle of the road Conservative candidate, strong military record, all of that sort of stuff, feels compelled to say, well, of course, I might consider leaving the ECHR, and then can't do an interview to defend that position to save his life. So it's these things they think they have to say. So I saw that and I thought that is the clearest indication that these people are not prepared to really confront the membership with a few home truths about the nature of the world that we actually live in. And so I think they are in a really difficult position.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. If people want to hear more from you, where can they find you on social media, internet, etc.?
Basically, I'm on Twitter, formerly known as X, or the other way around, and I have a website at the Centre for English Identity and Politics at Southampton University, where some of our more public-facing material, webinars, conferences, transcripts of speeches, and so on get posted. And I also have my own occasionally updated blog called The Optimistic Patriot.
Wonderful. Thank you, John. Diolch, John.
Thanks very much indeed.
If you've enjoyed what you've heard this evening, please don't forget to find us on all the socials at Hiraeth Pod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com, and thank you very much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/Hiraeth Pod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.